In 2018, I spent a summer working in Glacier National Park in northwest Montana. The mountains of Glacier are where I gained confidence in the outdoors, where I fell in love with scrambling and finding my way to high vantage points, where I learned to navigate steep slopes of scree and spent long days hiking across the park from valley to pass to valley to mountaintop. I saw grizzly bears crossing wildflower-filled meadows and spotted pikas, one of the most climate-sensitive animals. They only survive in temperatures under 70 degrees, as they squeaked away building their winter homes in fields of rocks. The mountains in the park tower thousands of feet above the valleys, pockmarked with glaciers and snow that used to be glacier, but now just exists as a permanent snowfield. Millions of visitors flock to Glacier National Park for its short summer season, from June through September, to drive the Going to the Sun Road through the park. But the namesake glaciers in the park are receding rapidly. In 2015, there were 26 ice fields that still met the definition of a glacier, which is snow and ice that is compacted down and is heavy enough to move under its own weight. Typically, anything under 25 acres is too small to move and is thus not considered a glacier. There were about 80 glaciers in Glacier National Park at the end of the last ice age. That summer, I hiked to many of the glaciers in the park, which spurred my personal fascination with ice and glacial-fed watersheds. The following summer, I worked on a glacier in Alaska as a guide. There, I saw glacial melt firsthand, with ice that changed every single day. Throughout the season, the ice fall and lake at the base of the glacier shifted dramatically, and as I hiked around the ice leading tours for tourists visiting the glacier, I would watch deep moulins, holes in the ice, open where there had been none the day before. Or I would see canyons formed by crevasses crack open to reveal the blue depths of the ice below. Over time, even these most dramatic features melted away, leaving only small bumps where there had once been a giant wall of ice. This glacier is nowhere close to melting away completely. It's 26 miles long and still has an accumulation zone where the glacier is still growing. But the toe of the glacier, where I worked and walked around every single day, is definitely receding. Not as fast as those in Glacier National Park, but being able to see that melting firsthand on a daily basis really instilled an understanding of how climate change is affecting our recreation areas. I'm Ilana Newman, and you're listening to Getaway. This podcast series will take us all over the country, from my home here in the Southwest to New Hampshire, West Virginia, Washington, Oregon, and Utah. We'll talk about what it means to be a recreation economy, how our rural communities are shifting, whether or not tourism and recreation are a boon for rural communities, the tourism housing crisis, how climate change could affect rural recreation economies, and how we access our public land. We'll talk to academics, community leaders, town employees, economists, recreationists, city officials, and so many other experts about what it means to create and exist as a sustainable rural recreation economy. Today we're talking about climate change and its effects on rural recreation economies, from melting glaciers, low snowpack, drought, flooding, wildfires, higher temperatures. Our rural communities are some of the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change for a whole host of reasons. I talked with Sarah Melotte, Daily Yonder data reporter, about some of the ways that rural communities face more vulnerability to climate change and natural disasters heightened by climate change. Sarah's reported a lot around the data on rural recreation economies, and she lives in Western North Carolina in an area that was heavily affected by Hurricane Helene last fall, so she's seen some of these effects firsthand. Rural areas are often more affected by climate change and natural disasters than urban spaces. Sarah, you've looked at some of the ways that the data shows this, like with wildfires and flooding and drought. Can you tell me a little bit about the data that you see around climate change in rural communities?
There's one caveat or a clarification that I want to make before I start citing some statistics, just because it's not necessarily that wildfires, flooding, and droughts happen more often in rural areas. It's that there's more vulnerability in rural areas for a few reasons that we'll get into. When you say they're more affected, it doesn't mean that there's going to be annually a higher likelihood that a rural county is going to experience a wildfire or a drought or a flood. It's that when it does happen there, sometimes there are economic and social challenges that makes it harder to recover or harder to prepare or adapt to climate change that causes those things. And so when we talk about rural communities being affected, that's what we mean. When we look at the national trend, rural areas have something that we call social vulnerability. They're more likely to be higher on the scale of social vulnerability.
Can you tell me a little bit more about social vulnerability? What does that mean?
Social vulnerability are the social and economic challenges that a rural or any kind of community can face when it comes to adapting to a natural disaster or coping with the disaster afterwards.
You say that rural communities have a higher social vulnerability. How does that work with communities dependent on recreation compared to communities not dependent on recreation? And what are we seeing across the country?
Rural recreation areas have a lower social vulnerability than other non-metropolitan areas in general. We see that recreation areas have higher incomes, they are more educated, and so some of these things contribute to have a place having a lower social vulnerability. But with that, it's also important to remember that this ERS definition is not perfect, and so in reality, a lot of places can be partly dependent on recreation but not meet the threshold to be categorized by the Economic Research Service as recreation. And so a lot of the places that we've looked at throughout this series are not technically categorized by the Economic Research Service as recreation. So I just kind of want to have our listeners understand that this is not all black and white. Yeah, these categorizations are kind of just to help us get a general overview. They don't capture all of the little intricate details and differences and variations in some of these economies.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, that this idea that rural America is just not a monolith. Not all recreation communities are the same. I mean, not all other types of rural communities, not all agricultural communities are the same. Not all extractive industry communities are the same. And that is kind of the focus for the series, to kind of look into some of those nuances and be able to talk about these things. But it also is really hard not to generalize when you're talking about the entire country and trying to draw conclusions. But hopefully, this series as a whole shows that nuance. It's not all one thing. Tell me a little bit more about some of the risks and vulnerability that certain communities face when it comes to social vulnerability and natural disasters.
Rural recreation economies, especially some of the smaller ones, smaller counties, smaller populations, if they have a huge chunk of their economy that is dependent on tourism and recreation, if climate change disrupts that somehow, they might not have the economic diversity to fall back on another industry to support their local community. That's not really, I think this data set on social vulnerability is really interesting to see which areas might be really vulnerable to some of these disasters, but it doesn't capture that point about recreation economies being, in my opinion, a little bit more economically vulnerable.
One of the places that climate change can be seen most easily is in winter recreation. Across the country, warmer winters are causing ski resorts, especially those that can't afford snowmaking technology, to close or shorten their seasons. Today, we're headed to New Hampshire to look at some of the ways that climate change is affecting communities dependent on winter recreation, like ski resorts. Julia Tilton is a reporter for the Daily Yonder who's from New Hampshire and has grown up skiing in the New Hampshire mountains. Julia, can you kind of set the scene for what skiing in New Hampshire is like? What are these communities like? What are they facing right now with warmer winters and less snow?
As you mentioned, Alana, I grew up in New Hampshire. I ski raced in middle school and high school in southern New Hampshire in the southern part of the White Mountains. I was curious because I can probably count on two hands the number of ski mountains that I have come across in New Hampshire during my time ski racing and then in the time since. And it seemed like there was a lot. So I did some research. And New England, which is the greater Northeast region, has 90 ski resorts as of 2025. And there's 28 in New Hampshire, which for a small state I thought was pretty impressive. I can speak to two in particular that I frequented when I was younger. Pat's Peak, which is located in Henniker, New Hampshire, which is a small town north of Concord, which is the state's capital. And then Crotched Mountain, which is in Francistown, New Hampshire, in the southern part of the state. I wanted to talk in particular about these two mountains because I think it's really interesting how they have diverged over the past decade and a half. Both were originally, small mountains. Pat's Peak is locally owned. The general manager has been in New Hampshire for decades and knows the region really well. And Crotched Mountain was originally locally owned or part of a small conglomerate. And then in recent years was picked up by the Epic Pass, which is of course owned by Vail Resorts. And it's just been really interesting to see these two very similarly sized mountains and how they have diverged in the sense that one is now part of this global corporation, right, that operates resorts all around the world, and one that is very rooted in New Hampshire, in small town New Hampshire and small town communities. And even in things like, with the risks of climate change, like what the technology that's accessible to those two mountains looks like, just as their resources are somewhat different given, who their owners are. New Hampshire as a state and New England as a region is experiencing climate change at one of the fastest rates in the country. The Northeast is just warming faster than other parts of the country, and precipitation patterns are changing faster and differently than in other places. And so obviously that impacts the ski season, right? Because if precipitation patterns are changing and temperatures are warming, that's going to do some funky things to snow. And for an industry that really relies on snow, and in many ways thinks of snow as its premier product for consumers and people that come to the state to recreate, the access to snowmaking technology is probably the most important thing and driver of whether or not a mountain is going to be successful.
What you're saying about especially Vail resorts, I think every community that's had a ski resort bought by Vail can relate to the changes that causes in a community. And that could be probably an entire other episode of the podcast in itself. But can you
Mm-hmm.
talk a little bit about the ways that these resorts are responding to these warmer winters and less snow? Because there is some interesting technology that has come up around snowmaking, and I know you've done some research and reporting on that in the past.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating what the snowmaking industry has become and how vital it is to surviving as a ski resort, particularly in the Northeast, right? Where even historically, snowfall was never to the extent that it is out west, right? It's just the mountains are at, much lower elevations. The precipitation is different. And so snowmaking from dating back to the 1970s and 80s has been in play. And I also found as I was sort of preparing for this that as of the early 2020s, 89% of all ski resorts now have snowmaking technology. And of course, in the Northeast, that's closer to 100% because it's almost impossible to operate without snowmaking technology. And without snowmaking technology, you would rely 100% on natural snow. And so in low snow years, that means that in many cases, the number of days that you're able to operate decreases. Thinking about these two resorts that I mentioned, Pat's Peak, which is locally owned, and Crotched Mountain, which is now part of the Epic Pass and Vail Resorts, the level of resources that each of those mountains now has to pursue snowmaking is very different, because on the one hand, you have a mountain that is backed by this global corporation that has the money to invest in snowmaking technology, which I should mention, I don't know if this was explicitly clear, but it's extremely expensive to make snow, because you are essentially pumping water and air uphill, on the order of thousands of feet, to then blast it out as snow, as sort of like man-made natural snow that's going to be used by skiers, and you have to keep doing that again and again and again over the course of a season. And so in terms of resources, both air and water, and then energy, it's extremely expensive, and the technology keeps changing. And so something that I found in past reporting that I think is really interesting is that as the climate changes and the snowmaking industry continues to gain sort of popularity in ski resorts across the country, but in the Northeast in particular, there's new technology that changes the temperature at which you can make snow. And so this is all sorts of science that I'm not going to try to go into because it gets really complicated really fast. But you would think, just sort of from a layman's perspective, that there is a freezing temperature, right? And eventually, if we get to a point where the temperature is no longer below freezing or at freezing, we get to a point where we can no longer make snow. And that's very quickly becoming a reality that is on the horizon. If you talk to scientists, and particularly climate scientists in the region, who are looking at complex climate models and projecting out what the temperatures are going to look like 10, 15, 20 years from now. But then you talk to people on the ground, and particularly community members who are, maybe not expert snowmakers, but work in the industry in one way or another, or work in, the restaurants, or in a small town that has tourism coming specifically for the purpose of sort of ski recreation. It's really interesting because there's a divergence in what's possible in thinking about like this new technology where you can make snow at higher temperatures. That seems really exciting. But then if you talk to a scientist, it's like, yeah, that seems really exciting for the next 10 to 15 years. And then what after that?
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think, yeah, the way that climate scientists are thinking about this is definitely going to be different than the average person who works and lives in these communities. I'm curious if you have talked to anyone, or if you can speak at all on how this is affecting the communities. How is it affecting kind of the economic development of these small towns that really rely on their ski area? Are they thinking at all about what that they're going to do as things evolve, or is it really kind of, we can ski right now, so we're going to?
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking that, there are some examples, I think, of maybe more optimistic changes and positive shifts in local recreation economies. The two mountains that I mentioned and have been talking about, Crotched and Pat's Peak, are both very small mountains in the sense that people are traveling to them for the day and then leaving. They're not often staying overnight. There are a number of mountains in the northern part of New Hampshire, which is where Mount Washington is. It's in it's in the White Mountains National Forest, and it's a popular destination for hikers and skiers all year round. And so that region, the White Mountains region, tends to attract more year-round visitors. And there are a couple of ski mountains there that I think are maybe examples of where the industry might be going and thinking about all seasons tourism rather than just one season tourism. Loon Mountain is one that I would point to. Loon Mountain is on the Icon Pass. So I don't know who the Icon Pass is owned by, but it's also one of this large conglomerates, which again, I think is interesting in thinking about this point of like local versus corporately owned. And Loon Mountain, for a long time, has really been, I think, ahead of the game on how it markets itself as a year-round destination. I was there this past winter, and I hadn't been there in a couple of years, and was just really struck by the number of homes that are going in. And I know that housing is something that you've talked about on this podcast, but thinking about homes that are built as second homes for all year visitation, right? So if you're purchasing a second home, you're coming in the winter to ski, but you're also coming in the summer to enjoy Loon Mountain's mountain biking paths, and you're coming in the fall to enjoy New England's fall foliage. And so it's interesting. Lincoln, New Hampshire, Lincoln Woodstock is the name of the town and community that hosts Loon Mountain, and just how that town has changed and become more populous as people continue to purchase land and build homes and move in, even though simultaneously the number of ski days is dwindling. It's interesting that this is a town that has been able to pivot and think about, okay, well, we also offer experiences in the fall, and we offer experiences in the summer, and the spring is sort of mud season. So I don't know how many people are trekking up to the White Mountains, but it certainly is no longer just this winter destination.
Yeah, and Altera is the one that
Altera.
owns Icon Pass. I think these conglomerates actually give these smaller ski resorts the opportunity to kind of work towards that 4-season or at least 2-season recreation. I've noticed that a lot of these resorts that are owned by Vail, by Altera, by Powder, they tend to develop, into a mountain bike park or have some sort of summer recreation on the resort as well. Whereas I think a lot of these family-owned businesses might just not have the resources or desire. They probably like having their summers off, whereas a corporation doesn't really care. So I think that's a really interesting piece of this conglomerate conversation, because they can provide resources like snowmaking, like summer recreation, that small family-owned businesses cannot. Julia, thank you so much for coming on Getaway and sharing some of your experiences with New Hampshire ski resorts and the ways that they're both thriving and dying because of climate change.
Yes, well, thank you for having me.
I talked with a professor in New Hampshire who studies climate change and has looked a lot at its effects on recreation economies.
I'm Dr. Elizabeth Burakowski. I'm a research assistant professor here at the University of New Hampshire. One of my main areas of research is looking at how winter climate changes affect the winter tourism industry. And that's important for here in New Hampshire because about half of our visitor spending in the North Country comes from the ski industry. And it's a big part of our culture here in New Hampshire. Outdoor recreation is a really big part of the economy, and it's a really big part of communities, and especially our small rural communities up in the North Country.
Can you tell me a little more about the ways that you see climate change affecting the rural economies in New Hampshire?
Yeah, so in New Hampshire, a lot of our smaller ski resorts are, dependent on cold temperatures. They're dependent on natural snowfall to really drum up the enthusiasm for attracting visitors. There is a documented what they call backyard hypothesis or backyard effect, especially when it relates to folks from the south of us that are coming to visit our state. So people from Massachusetts, when they see snow in their backyards, they get really excited about it. And that drives them to New Hampshire to say, we want to go skiing in the White Mountains. And we also have a lot of other offerings in winter recreation. So I recently did a study on ice climbing. I myself am not an ice climber, but I got to meet and talk with a bunch of ice climbers and hear about what impacts they've been seeing. And some of the impacts can be related to the changing conditions, but also the changing crowding issues. And so when you do have a really good year and it's concentrated in just a few weekends or a few weeks instead of spread out over a much longer period of time, it can lead to overcrowding issues. It can also lead to a mentality of I'm going to take on a higher risk to ensure that I can get out there when it is in. We see this also with backcountry skiing. So in terms of incidents of people going out into avalanche terrain when otherwise it might not be as safe. But if it's been a long time since we've had a good snowfall event, you do see the number of skiers that are going out increase substantially. We also worry a lot about, ice. Ice is on top of our rivers and our lakes and streams. That too brings recreational opportunities. And here in the Seacoast, I actually had an opportunity this winter to go ice skating on one of the local rivers nearby. And it was such a rare treat. I hardly ever get to do that. It was probably the first time in over a decade that I felt comfortable and safe going out on the Lamprey River on my ice skates. We also have a lot of opportunities up north. I mean, the pond hockey tournaments, the ice fishing derbies, snowmobiling. All of these are reliant on cold temperatures, and they're reliant on safe ice conditions and opportunities to even make snow. Especially a lot of our resorts here in New Hampshire are spending quite a bit of money and have made substantial investments in snowmaking technology, which is great because snowmaking, quite frankly, it does open up a lot of opportunities when otherwise we might not have an opportunity to go skiing. But there are other concerns. So, for example, if we have a dry fall and a dry summer running into the snow season and the ski resorts are filling their snowmaking ponds with river water, if those rivers are at lows, then they have a hard time even filling the ponds. So it's usually we don't think too much about New Hampshire having a dry season, but we do run into summer base flow in terms of our rivers. And when the timing becomes off, when we see a reduction in the amount of water or too much water coming at once, that too can also have resounding impacts during our winter recreation time. I think a lot about the event that we had in December of 2023. And we had a really heavy rain on snow on frozen ground on a relatively early big snowpack, and the damages that caused. And it's not just that that ski resorts were closed or that they lost snow, but it was also a shock to our communities. When you have that type of devastation taking out roads and taking out homes and having to rebuild after that, and kind of process that impact on your community, it can take a lot out of you. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that it's not just about the dollars and cents. It's about the impacts to your community and the connections.
Can you just talk a little bit about some of the data around what is happening over time with the climate, and what are those effects on the ground, whether that's weather events or drought, or just set the stage for what is happening with our climate and our winter recreation?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about winter in New England, what stands out is just how rapid the warming has been. I moved here in the late 80s when I was a child, and since that time, we've seen winters warm on the order of 4 or 5 degrees. If you go back to 1970, a place like Concord, New Hampshire has warmed upwards of 7, 8 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a lot for a specific region to be really seeing this concentration of really rapid warming during our winter season. The only other places in the US that rival that rate of warming would be the upper Midwest. So up in like Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin region. And we've been hearing similar impacts on their communities too. When they look at the impact of warming winters, they're looking at less snow cover. We're seeing that here in New England. If you go back to like 1916 or so look at, I don't know, past 110 years, when you look at those long-term trends, we're looking at a loss of about 3 weeks of snow cover in the Northeast, and especially in northern New England. So instead of having this continuous period of winter where your snowpack arrives and it stays, you have this middle interruption of brown and gray and twigs instead of that widespread snow that I grew up with as a child, that I remember winters being. The snow came, and then it wasn't until spring that it went away. And when you look at how that's changed over time, so over the period like 1980 to 2005, so when I was growing up in New Hampshire as a kid, when we look at the number of snow-covered days with that deep snowpack, it's roughly across this region from Pennsylvania up to Maine, you're looking at about 60 days on average. Lower in the southern part of the region, higher in the northern part of the region. And if we had continued with emitting greenhouse gases the way we were prior to the Paris Agreement, so think of the trajectory we were on pre-2015, before countries came together in the United Nations Treaty to say, we need to address this carbon accumulation problem in our atmosphere, we were looking at a decline in the amount of snowpack by about a month or so. So instead of seeing 60 days of snowpack, by the end of the century, we would be looking at less than a month of deep snowpack. That's like a 50% loss that you're looking at. When we act on climate, it's better. We still see snowpack loss because ultimately what we need to do is get emissions to zero to stop accumulating carbon in the atmosphere. Even with that, you're still only at about 36 days. So you save a week or two by acting on climate. But what it says is that we need to do more than just what the climate policies were after the Paris Agreement. And it needs to be aggressive, and it needs to be now.
Can you talk a little bit about what are the economic impacts and community impacts of climate change and our loss of winter?
And so when we look at something like New Hampshire, this is from a report that we published back in 2018 with Protect Our Winters. And when we look at a place like New Hampshire, it ends up being, I think it was about 2.1 million skier visits averaged over the period from 2001 to 2016. And I'll say that 2016, if you were in New Hampshire, you would know that that was not one of our best years. It was our second warmest year on record that we had. So the winter of 2015-16 was a little bit of a low point in terms of both skier visitation and warmer temperatures. But what you see when you look at skier visitation and you look at the number of like days with snow cover, for example, you see a tight correlation. When we have snowier winters, we typically have more skier visits. When we have less snowy winters, we have lower skier visits. And that's a pretty strong relationship in New Hampshire, especially over that period, 2000 to 2016. And in terms of the amount of numbers, when you're looking at this, you can look at a couple of different metrics I'll tell you about would be the number of jobs that are supported by, say, the ski industry or the winter tourism industry. And a place like New Hampshire in 2015-16, it was about 5,700 jobs. If you start looking at a better year, you could probably inflate that number by a good like 10 or 15% because 2015-16 was one of our worst years. When you look at the economic activity or value added into the economy, so that would include your direct spending at the resorts. So someone bought a lift ticket, they went to the lodge and they got lunch. Maybe they went to the ski shop on the actual like resort property and bought something there. That's all the direct spending at that resort. You could also have the indirect spending. So that would be money if you stay in a condo nearby and maybe you went to a restaurant downtown or you decided to go shopping at an outlet that's nearby. That would all be indirect spending. So you're still spending money because you're there skiing and you are locally purchasing items in that community. We also have the induced spending. And this one's really important because it's the money that people receive as a business. So if you own a ski rental shop in Conway, New Hampshire, you're paying your employees. Your employees are then able to pay their rent. They're able to buy groceries. Maybe they can go out to dinner with their families. They send their kids to daycare. All of that money continues to circulate in their local economy as long as it's for local purchases. And so modeling this is not an easy task. You have to make some assumptions about percentages of those different numbers are staying in the community versus, getting spent elsewhere. But in a place like New Hampshire, that value added from having a winter tourism industry adds up to hundreds of millions of dollars. In our study, we estimated about $340 million. And we didn't have ice fishing in there. We didn't have our pond hockey tournaments in there. Those local events can draw a ton of people and bring in a lot of spending. So I would say that $340 million, again, it's conservative in terms of the estimate because we're looking mostly just at the downhill ski industry. But we're also looking at one of the worst years that we had.
Jada Lindblom is the Community and Economic Development Field Specialist in Belknap County, New Hampshire, one of the locations Sarah Melotte visited during her reporting on recreation in New Hampshire. We asked Jada what she sees as the biggest issues facing winter tourism in her region of New Hampshire.
Well, certainly, from the infrastructural side and the technology side, snowmaking is huge. New Hampshire has been ahead of the curve in some ways with snowmaking, with most of the major resorts really leaning heavily on snowmaking system upgrades. And the systems are way more efficient than they used to be and require a lot of maintenance and attention, but there's just a lot more possibilities of what they can do. And not just snowmaking. I think we talk about snowmaking a lot, but there's a lot to be said for grooming and the really skilled people that work on grooming at ski areas to make sure that the slopes can maintain the snow as well as they do and keep the conditions safe and fun for everyone. But, there's a lot of challenges also. There's a lot of sports that can't rely on snowmaking, of course, like snowmobiling is a tough one with weather variability, and they've had a lot of years that are really challenging. There's still some things that you can do. You can really maintain trails that are cleared of debris, that are more level surfaces, so that even if there is a more minimal amount of snow, it's still reasonably usable. And that's true for Nordic skiing as well to some extent. But there's a lot of in the winter just waiting for news of a storm coming your way and hoping that it goes the direction of being nice fluffy snow and not rain or slush or sleet. We get all different types of precipitation in New Hampshire in the winter time. So and sometimes you don't know until it's actually happening what direction it's going to go.
I also asked Dr. Burakowski about what she's seeing communities do to become more resilient as a community and an economy in the face of warming winters and climate change.
One thing we've noticed, we had gone up to one of the larger mountains in Vermont last winter, and it was raining, and my son was not feeling it. And no, I'm like, I don't blame you. I'm not a big fan of snowboarding in the rain either. You get soaking wet, your feet are cold. It's, not the best snow. But fortunately, where we went had an indoor fun center with 4 bounce houses, and they had indoor bowling. They had, a wonderful selection of pools to choose from. And we were very fortunate that we were able to pivot and find something else for him to do. And his little sister, she wasn't at that point skiing anyway. So that too was another benefit of going to this specific place. So you're seeing quite a bit of that. And I think it's successful, but at the end of the day, it's not a solution. I try to remind folks that one of the ways that we might experience a change in climate is that a reduction in the number of days we can go out and ski, a reduction in the number of days when we look outside and it is a snowy landscape. That's, maybe that's your lived experience. But other folks' lived experience can be vastly different from that. And it could include a complete loss of their home in a forest fire, in a coastal flood, in inland flooding. It could also mean a total loss of your community. Very large fires can consume entire towns. We try to rebuild after that, but it's a very substantial event in one's life to go from I can't ski one day to I've lost my entire community. And so trying to get folks to have that conversation and think about those tough topics, I think is important. You have to start with leading with what your lived experience is and then consider what others' lived experience might be as well. But I hope that people also recognize that this is part of how we preserve our communities and our resources for future generations and our own generation. I mean, this change from winters that were cold and snowy to winters that are warm and slushy, that's hope and over my lifetime. And I've still got probably several more decades to go in terms of the amount of change that we're going to see. And it's not going to slow down unless we do something about this. So the time to act is now. And I think people are starting to take action. They're starting to notice. And if they want to know what to do, they need to show up and vote. They need to participate and talk to their community members. Whenever there's a conversation about policies that are going to improve infrastructure in their community, they need to be thinking about the long-term repercussions on climate and have that be part of the conversation.
As Dr. Burakowski says, climate action needs to happen now. Otherwise, our rural communities will suffer from loss of homes, from loss of economy, from loss of landscapes. Wildfires are happening at an increasing frequency in places like New Hampshire where they don't historically happen. Extreme weather causes flooding, landslides, fire, and other damage. And these extreme weather events and rising temperatures are inextricably linked to humans and our use of fossil fuels primarily. With less snow, drier seasons, smoke from fires, and loss of infrastructure due to these disasters, tourists will be less likely to visit rural communities that are otherwise dependent on recreation. However, whether communities should be completely dependent on recreation and tourism is a complete other question. Having a diversified economy makes an area more resilient to industries going bust, no matter whether that industry is tourism or extraction. Rural areas need to support growth and entrepreneurship and continue thinking of ways to attract new industries that fit well for their needs, which are going to be different everywhere. In our next and final episode of Getaway, we're going to be talking about this balance of industries, looking at how historic industries balance out with tourism, and also thinking about ways to avoid falling into a trap of being overly dependent on something like tourism that is still susceptible to setbacks like a changing climate. We'll be visiting Washington's southern coast in Pacific County and looking at the ways that this region is developing their own recreation industry. That's next time on Getaway. You've been listening to Getaway on the Rural Remix podcast feed. This episode was produced and edited by me, Ilana Newman. Julia Tilton is our associate producer, and our executive producer is Joel Cohen. Original music by Quincy Ponver and Leo Posel. Reporting for this series was made possible in part with support from the Lore Foundation. Lore works with people in the rural Mountain West to improve quality of life. Rural Remix is a production of the Center for Rural Strategies, and we would like to thank the staff of the Daily Yonder and the Rural Assembly.